Good afternoon, a very warm welcome to Conversations. My name's Amelie Butler, I'm the Conversations Curator. I'm a little bit sad because this is the last talk in the Conversation series, but we couldn't finish on a more fascinating subject, which is the implications for copyright and ownership raised by blockchain technology. And I'm really thrilled that we're joined by a panel of artists and experts who are working in different parts of the art world who are affected by this topic. The panel will be moderated by Droitcour, who's the editor-in-chief of Outland magazine, which is an online blockchain art magazine. There'll be time to ask some questions at the end of the panel, and I'll try and relay some from our online chat. Before I hand over to Brian to introduce our speakers, please do join me in giving Bernadine, Amelie, Sarah, and Primavera, and Brian a very warm welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Amelie. I think this will be a very interesting conversation. Our panelists come from very different perspectives, some thinking more about solutions offered by blockchain and others really focus on exploring the problems. And to start, I'd just like to ask everyone to introduce themselves and talk about what they're working on. Primavera, why don't we start with you?
So I'm Primavera Filippi. I'm a legal scholar, so I'm working as a researcher at the CNRS in Paris and at the Berkman Center at Harvard. And it's been now since 2013, so it's been 10 years now that all of my research is focusing on the legal challenges and opportunities of blockchain technology. And before that, I was studying and researching copyright. So somehow blockchain and copyright came into NFTs, and now I'm focusing most of my research on NFTs. And on the side, or simultaneously, I'm an artist, and so I always have been using my artistic practice to illustrate and to challenge my research. And so since I started working on blockchain technologies as a researcher, I also started creating blockchain-based art pieces as a direct illustration of the challenges that I was looking at.
Should we demonstrate this
Let's try.
Project here? Okay. Do you want to talk about what it is?
Yeah, I can try to describe. So Plantoid is a project, so it's a blockchain-based life form. Brian is now going to help it in the reproduction process. So a blockchain-based life form is something that actually lives on the blockchain. The body is this physical sculpture, but the spirit of the plantoid lives on the Ethereum blockchain. And so just like any other blockchain-based life forms, a plantoid is trying to reproduce itself. While traditional plants rely on butterflies and bees to help them in the pollination process, plantoids actually rely on the capitalization process, and so they try to attract humans because they know that humans love capital, and so they are asking humans to feed them with some cryptocurrencies, and then they are co-creating with the feeder an art piece that then will be minted as an NFT and will be sent back to the person that has sent the funds. And then every time this NFT is sold on the secondary market, the royalties go back to the plantoid. And this enables the plantoid to then accumulate more and more capital up to the point in which it has acquired enough funds in order to ensure its reproduction. And then it becomes a DAO, so it opens a call for proposals. And people can submit propositions about how they envision to produce the next plantoid, and then all the people that hold the NFTs, the seed of the plantoid, they can vote on the proposition that they like the most. And then once a winner has been identified, then the plantoid will automatically transfer all the funds that it has collected to the selected winner, which is then hired, commissioned by the plantoid to create a new copy of itself. So, and the idea with this is also to illustrate how we are kind of like flipping copyright on its head, in the sense that usually when we like specific artworks, we are giving money to the artist, and we are hoping and expecting that the artist will continue to create works that we like. Whereas, because of blockchain technologies, now we have this newfound possibility of sending money to the art piece itself, and then it is the art piece that, controlling the funds, will then select who is the artist that will be eligible, entitled to actually create a new copy of itself.
Okay, so the transaction went through, but and I tried pressing. It looked like the colors were changing a little bit, so I pressed the heart. But
No, it's not yet. It's
not yet. Okay.
No.
All right.
It's gonna take a bit. Are you sure it went through? Is it not pending?
Yeah. It said the transaction is complete.
Is it through? Just wait a little bit, we'll see.
All right. Bernadine, do you want to go next while we wait for Plantoid?
I don't know if I'll be able to match that. Hi, I'm Bernadine Bröcker Wieder. I'm the CEO of a blockchain company called Arcual. We have a booth up in the collector's lounge here if you're interested to talk to the team. But going back to what Primavera was describing, artists are working in new media, in new methods, for physical artworks, and at Arcual, at least you said to talk about a blockchain project we're working on right now. We're focusing on physical art using, we're focusing on using blockchain to help document all the information around a physical artwork. So instead of being a tokenization of the artwork itself, we're tokenizing the agreements. And as a result of doing that, you actually are able to facilitate a lot more functionalities. So one of the ones that was already mentioned by Primavera is royalties, that artists can receive royalties for future sales of their work. And but there are other things, for example, instant payouts to introducers or to the artists themselves. You can have blockchain-based certificates of authenticity and follow the provenance of an artwork. But so myself, I've been looking at blockchain since 2015. Since I heard about it, I thought this is really interesting for the art industry because we have data silos and a lot of different people owning the information throughout the industry, and it's very hard to get a single source of truth. So if there was a way to get information in a usable format so that it can actually get digitized, that would be brilliant. So that's a bit about me.
Thank you. Amelie?
Hi everyone, and thank you Brian, and thanks to Amelie and the Art Basel team for inviting me to be part of this panel. I used to be a lawyer in intellectual property litigation, mostly focusing on trademarks and designs, and it's now been almost 8 years that I have started working for the Art Loss Register, which is a database of stolen, looted art and art that is in dispute. So say an artwork is stolen from you, you can register that with the Art Loss Register, or you are a bank and you give a loan on an artwork that is secured by art, then you can register this artwork with us so that for the duration of the loan agreement, it cannot be sold without your knowledge. And that's the second thing we do. We use the data on our database to check the market. So we are the primary object due diligence provider and work with Art Basel, for example, to make sure that the works that are being sold here can be sold with good title. And then our focus is very much, unfortunately, quite often on where things go wrong. So where we do identify an object as problematic, we help resolve the issue by bringing the parties to the table and to talk normally and find a solution. And that's also sort of my angle at blockchain. The Art Loss Register is not a blockchain-based database, but it is a database that does start to register NFTs now that have been stolen. And we are sort of trying to find out what happens when that goes wrong. How does blockchain technology change the approach to solving problems? And I'm hoping to find some answers on many, many, many questions that I have on this panel today.
Sarah?
Yeah, happily. Thank you for all the introductions, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm an artist and software developer. I've also been working in the blockchain industry for quite some time in a number of capacities. So perhaps in a past life as a software developer at a large blockchain company, independently as a technical contributor, and also in my work as an artist. probably the blockchain work that I am known best for is called life forms. So already we see a parallel here, perhaps, between the plantoid and this project. The life forms that I created are NFT-based entities. Like any living thing, they need to be cared for in order to stay alive. The way that you care for a life form is within 90 days of receiving it, you have to give it away. So the life forms sort of shift the assumptions, perhaps, of the speculative NFT marketplace, where maybe the normal behavior is to buy and hold an NFT, hoping it will accrue value. The life forms do not allow this. Instead, they sort of change, or try to change, the meaning of ownership to become temporary and collaborative. I would be remiss if I did not also briefly tell you about a new digital life form that I have been summoning, which is currently in an exhibit at the HEC in Basel right now. I have been using AI to create an alter ego of myself, who is a not safe for work content creator. So you can go lurk her social media in video form there right now.
Great. It looks like the plantoid is responding to my transaction, so I'm going to press this button. Oh, shoot, I didn't hold the microphone.
Answer.
Okay. One where stewardship is valued more than ownership.
Okay, so what is happening now is Plantoid is listening to what Brian has said and is processing it through using like ChatGPT and OpenAI, and is creating an oracle from the future, which it has just printed, and now it's gonna read it to you. And then
reality, where values of stewardship are more enshrined in sin than stewardship of property. Commonly was our aim. It creates our collective stability, realizing shared resources. We move with leverage. Interoperability should provide the tools of planetary health. We should restore a common plan for a connected group. Let us all follow this dream. Unity in our hearts and minds. For stewardship is the key. Let us mourn what's left behind.
okay, so that's the oracle, and then this is now being processed on the Raspberry, and the Plantoid is generating a little video that incorporates this oracle, and then you will receive it in your NFT, in your wallet.
Okay, I couldn't really make out any of what it said, but I suppose that's typical for oracles, very mysterious beings. Just to like shift from the plantoid for a second, Primavera, I wanted to ask you about your legal scholarship. You co-authored a book in 2018 called Blockchain and the Law, where you discussed this concept of lex cryptographica, the idea that anything recorded on the blockchain has the force of law behind it. And I was hoping you could sort of explain where that concept comes from, and has it been tested in any courts? Would it stand up to a legal contest?
Yeah, so the idea with lex cryptographica is to kind of like contrast it with lex informatica, which was, so Lawrence Lessig came up with the expression code is law back in 2000s in order to show how technology can have the same effect as law on the digital world. And yet, lex informatica can actually easily be regulated because it is managed by those online operators, by those intermediaries. And so the law cannot easily regulate directly the code, but the law can regulate the intermediaries, which then regulate the code. And so the lex informatica has the capacity to act as law, but is not autonomous from the existing legal system. So the idea with Lex Cryptographica was to raise this. There is a new challenge that comes about with the advent of blockchain technologies, which is that we are actually creating not only systems that can have the effect of law, but also that becomes more and more autonomous or difficult to regulate by the law. And so the title of the book was The Rule of Code. And the idea is really to illustrate that there is increasingly some kind of discrepancy that can come about between the rule of law and the rule of code, and especially in the context of smart contract or property. If I am the owner of an NFT, for instance, I am the technical holder of that, and the rule of code operates according to its own technological framework, even though the law might say that actually I acquired this NFT illegitimately, and so I'm not the legal owner, and yet I am the technical owner. And so the rule of code and the rule of law, all of a sudden they start engaging into this discrepancy where even though a court order were to say that I'm not the holder of the NFT, it is really difficult, unless you have my private key, to actually seize that asset from me. Right? And so this technological framework that is ruled by code becomes somehow separated with the legal framework that is based on the rule of law. And blockchain technology, of course, there is no full autonomy. There is always ways in which the legal system can find and make pressures, but it cannot have a direct intervention on this technological interface.
Mm-hmm. So, Amelie, you also deal with situations where there is a dispute of ownership, where there might be a history of illegal activity in a chain of an artwork's ownership. Do you think that blockchain has an impact on the kind of work you do? Have you encountered any situations involving NFTs yet, or is it still kind of speculative for you?
I mean, to me, blockchain is an incredible record of evidence and hopefully in some ways of provenance as well in the future. The disputes that we have seen so far have actually sort of made me question how transparent the system is. So, for example, we've been asked to advise a gallery in Berlin. I can talk about this case. They were called Office Impart, and their wallet had been hacked, and 3 NFTs were stolen from them. And they then did something very clever. They basically, of course, knew where the NFTs, in which wallets the NFTs were now, but they didn't know who owned the wallets. And so they went public with it and tweeted about it and said, we have been hacked and we are looking for 3 NFTs and these are them. And one person got in touch with them and said, look, I recently bought this one NFT by Harm van den Dorpel, and I think it's one of the ones that you are looking for. Do you want to buy it back? And they were like, well, no, not really, because it was stolen from us. So then they called me and were like, what do we do now? And I was like, oh God, I've never had that case before. And then the lawyer and me started thinking, oh dear, what law is applicable? I have no idea where this transaction took place, and all of these questions. And then I was like, hold on, but at the Atlas Register, we normally bring parties to the table to talk, and you can try to do that here as well. Obviously, you've got no way to find out who owns the wallet, but you can try to engage in a conversation, and that's exactly what they did. They actually entered into a conversation with the person who got in touch with them. They even had a video call, and they realized actually both of them had been the victims of crime, right? One was a theft and the other one was a fraud. And so both of them had paid for the same item, and they were trying to find a solution around that. And that's where blockchain actually is quite amazing, or the fact that it was in digital artwork, because the solution they found, which I think is incredibly elegant, is they entered into an agreement to co-own the NFT, and they created a shared wallet where the NFT was then put, and where they are now co-owning it together. And if they ever decide to sell the NFT, they will have to agree on that, but they can then also split the proceeds of the sales, which is something that we do very much in our daily work at the Atlas Register. And I thought that was an incredible approach to it, very pragmatic, but of course the question of what law would apply had the current holder of the NFT not been willing to engage. So if they weren't willing to talk, how do you enforce your rights? That's a big question for me, and that's not answered yet. But it was a cool case, and it also showed one interesting tool that, I don't know, maybe Bernadine, you know more about, OpenSea, the platform who held the NFT, actually the gallery asked them to freeze their assets, and that, I think, in a way also helped bringing the parties to the table to talk. So yeah, I'm interested in seeing how future disputes are dealt with and whether there will be even maybe an alternative dispute resolution very much embedded in blockchain technology.
Mm-hmm. So Bernadine, Arcual is still fairly new. It launched in the last year, and I imagine it hasn't been around long enough for there to be disputes, but I'm wondering what kind of measures you've implemented foreseeing that, and how you kind of deal with the difference between legal ownership and technical ownership when you're encoding the agreements.
Yeah, I love listening to Primavera talk about this because it's exactly what the lawyers we've been working with have been thinking about in terms of enforceability and how you make this work, because in essence you could have someone owning an Arcual record and not having the physical artwork, and how does that actually work? So what we've gone for is prevention rather than enforcement, so kind of trying to architect the system to enforce good behavior rather than trying to go into the dispute straight away. We have thought about disputes as well, but yeah, I think prevention is better, especially with a new system that just launched in December. So the way that we've approached it is, for example, if you're on OpenSea and you're minting an artwork, a digital artwork, you do that on your own. As an artist, you go and you mint your work. With our system, you can only do that with a counter-signatory. So you have to be an artist working with a gallery, and the gallery is kind of like a test to the fact that this artwork exists, and it's a consignment agreement from the artist to the gallery for that first sale as it goes out of the studio. And then when the collector purchases the work, the token of certificate of ownership transfers from the artist's wallet to the collector's wallet, but it's all through the consignment agreement done with the gallery. So you kind of create some enforceability through these agreements, and our system also has legal agreements on top of the actual blockchain agreements so that you can know what the terms are, and every party does agree to those terms when you're using the system. So I wouldn't say that we're relying solely on the blockchain. It's very much blockchain interlinked with law in order to make it work. And even then, I'm sure there will be disputes at some point, but you kind of have to do what you can to avoid them in advance.
Mm-hmm. I know a lot of DAOs, or these blockchain-based organizations, use what's called multi-signature wallets
Yes.
as a way to ensure that a transaction is approved by several stakeholders before it goes through. It sounds like Arcual uses a similar system, and also maybe the shared wallet that Office in part created with the collector also offers some more security. Would you?
Sorry.
So whether you
like the
use
shared wallet, yeah.
Yeah. Is
At
it
the
a
Atlas
multi-signature wallet that they decided to use with each other? Was it
Yes.
actually coded in, or was it a legal agreement?
It was a legal agreement, as far as I know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems, right? Is a lot of people don't know how to use the technology yet. So there are technological solutions, but then there are a lot of people who don't know how to use them. Mm-hmm. And so the future will be that you create those systems there, but you kind of have to mitigate against them sometimes with legal agreements for those that don't quite understand the technology side. Mm-hmm. And no, we're not using multi-sig yet. It's actually, we do all of the transactions in one transaction. So the consignment agreement, the transfer of the wallet, the transfer of the token, and everything happens in the same blockchain transaction. So that's how we make sure that it's all done correctly. I hope I'm saying it in a more layman's terms, easy way that makes it understandable.
Okay. So Sarah, you conceived Lifeforms as a project that encourages collectors to think about ownership as this collective act of care. And I'm also thinking about your background as a software engineer, you've worked on a lot of open source projects, and that is another different sort of approach to ownership or stewardship. I mean, who owns an open source project? What is involved in the maintenance of that sort of work? And does it have anything to tell us about how blockchain creates ownership?
So I do think of the life forms and the way that they need to be looked after as maybe related to the way that I, as an artist who makes digital things, which are all open source code bases, need to look after and care for those code bases, or they will, in some sense, die. All of my artworks are, in a way, like my life forms. In the case of a big open source project with many contributors, it definitely takes on a life that is bigger than any one contributor. Naming or describing exactly what constitutes that life is difficult, but it is alive the way a blockchain itself is alive, with a community of people participating in it, kind of animating this software with the stuff that they are doing. And similarly, it can die. Now, in the case of who owns an open source code base, I would love to hear from some of the legal scholars on the panel about this. But I think there are, maybe different cases. In the case of an open source repo that I have been the major contributor to and maintain, I own it. There's an entire dialogue about open source licensing. For example, so I may or may not have put a license on that, which gives you permission to use it in certain ways or not. It may be run by a company, in which case they would have placed these protections from outside the code onto it as well. So I think that the technical answer of who owns open source code is very particular to the code base itself. I would love to hear from Primavera if I got any of that wrong.
I think from a technical perspective, code is owned by the one that actually controls access to the code. When it's open source, you kind of decide to willingly open it up to anyone to actually look at least at the code. And then there is the legal license, which create a system in which you're still the copyright owner, but all of a sudden you can no longer enforce your exclusive rights in order to prevent people from reproducing, creating derivative works, and so forth. So you're using kind of like a legal mean to create this kind of legally autonomous code that then can evolve independently of the will of the original author and copyright owner. And then I think when blockchain comes in, I think there is this beautiful state change that comes about in the sense that all those, whether it's code or it's Creative Commons, when you create open source, legally open content, you're kind of, as an author, you say, I don't want to be the only one controlling the way in which this thing will evolve. And so it starts becoming more of an autonomous life form to that extent. I think the beauty that comes about when you're adding the blockchain component to that is that it's not just that you have this content that can evolve based on what people want, you also give to the content, to the art piece, you're giving it technological and economic agency. And so all of a sudden you're creating something which is deployed on the blockchain, which actually can technologically enforce specific contract, and that can also accumulate funds, which is completely new. All the time with open source software, you always need people that are funding its development, whether it's the open source community or a company. And all of a sudden with blockchain, you can actually create those things that can accumulate funds, and with those funds then hire or pay people, pay contributors in order to help it evolve. And I think that's where a blockchain system has even more autonomy, and it's even more likely to be called a life form because it also has this agency that comes from a technological and economical framework.
Mm-hmm. So you spoke earlier about this idea of code as law and how things are enforced by the blockchain technology. I wanted to talk about Arcual in this context because it is a private blockchain. It's not transparent in the same way that Ethereum or Bitcoin is. And it is based on a proof, like a reputation verification system. I was hoping you could talk about that, Bernadine, and in this context also of this like shared stewardship that Sarah and Primavera have been discussing.
Yeah, I think so. The background of this project that now is known as Arcual is that it was all predicated by this idea that we need to champion artists and make sure that they are rewarded throughout their career. And I think also that art is changing form, so keeping track of what the art is and what the artist envisaged for that work needs to be documented somewhere. But it also has stakeholders that come from the traditional art market, so we're trying to be a bit of a bridge between what is happening on the public networks and what's happening, for example, here at Art Basel. And so you have, by building a private blockchain that is based on proof of authority rather than proof of stake or proof of work, you're almost emulating the way the art world works now, that kind of if bad behavior is, so the enforceability kind of comes from your reputation and tarnishing your reputation rather than because you'll lose some Bitcoin or those types of things. And, but that's, just to backtrack a little bit, I think people often get confused between how the data is stored and how that network works versus the application layer that the artist, gallery, collector, whoever might be engaging interacts with. Because when we're talking about how that information is stored in the blockchain, a lot of the time it's about a hash, which no one would be able to read, right? And it's just some encrypted, some letters that represent a transaction, but it's not really legible to any human eye. So what we're talking about on the blockchain level is who are the custodians of those hashes and that information. And in the public networks, those custodians are, can be anyone, because you just have to download some software and start mining in that network, and you get a certain level of governance by that breadth of involvement. Whereas in our proposal, it's invitation only, it's by reputation, and that those custodians are people that at least so the three founders are MCH Group, the parent company of Art Basel, the Luma Foundation, which is a nonprofit dedicated to art, and Boston Consulting Group, a big partnership that some of you may have heard of. And so the thought process is that even if Arcual no longer exists, those custodians of the information do. And so people can continue building applications that go to that database on that blockchain, even if whatever application we've built doesn't exist, because those custodians are there. I hope people followed what I was saying there. But so then we often get stuck on the application layer, which is kind of the thing that everyone interacts with. But really, when you're talking about blockchain, often we're just talking about that data storage and who is enforcing those smart contracts, those automated formulas, and who is making sure that you can continue to use it. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely, obsolescence is always an issue with technology, and there are early blockchain-based platforms for trading art like Ascribe that was founded in 2015 and no longer exists, and a lot of the NFTs that were on it were just lost. And so, but on the other hand, since then, like I think on the Tezos blockchain, there was this platform Hicket Nunk for NFTs, and that was shut down by its founders, but then everything was able to be retrieved because it was on chain. So.
Yeah, I guess that's also the thing. You kind of need sorry, I think you were about to say something.
No, don't worry.
That you need. It would be fantastic in a utopian world that everyone had their own wallets and we could use peer-to-peer networks to interact with each other, and that we could create programmatic interfaces that worked. But when we look at the real world and what keeps happening is people constantly trust others to handle that for them. So they don't want to remember their private key, they trust someone to keep that. They don't want to figure out how to write their own smart contract, so they trust a marketplace to do that. And so a lot of this high-tech stuff relies on you to trust intermediaries to be able to use it. And the question is, who are these intermediaries and can we govern them? Can they freeze assets? Can they do things to help the people using the system?
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think that obsolescence is a very core question, and I think it's really about to which extent is the information that is being recorded on-chain or on a network that remains accessible even when the intermediary dies. And I think there are different types of intermediaries. There is intermediaries that are actually holding on, not just intermediating the transaction, but that are also holding the data on their own centralized server. The moment in which this intermediary shuts down, then nothing is retrievable anymore, as opposed to other types of intermediaries which are just intermediating the transaction, but nonetheless recording the data on a blockchain, recording the content on a decentralized IPFS, whatever you want. And in that case, even once the intermediary is gone, and I agree most people will choose to go through an intermediary, but we have to be careful to use an intermediary that is actually recording data on-chain so that you don't bet on the survival, on the forever survival of the intermediaries, because even as long as once the transaction has been made, then as long as the blockchain remains, and you need to be sure that it's a blockchain that will remain, then you can always retrieve even if the platform is shut down, a new platform can emerge and can still read the data, and so you didn't actually lose the content and you didn't lose the NFTs.
I think if I may jump in there, it's super interesting for me to hear that because it's kind of what the ALR went through in the last 30 years in a way when we were set up as the first database for stolen, looted, private database for stolen and looted art. Then there were other databases and some of them went bust, and then we took over that data, and then there was the initial credibility and reputation came very much through the fact that it was a market initiative that said, the insurance industry said, we want one source where we can record things that were stolen so that when they come back, we can actually claim them. And the market said, we want one source where we can conduct some due diligence so that we don't sell things that are problematic. And that was kind of the starting point that gave it the credibility to survive and basically to take over other data. And to me, I think we spoke a little bit about that yesterday, Primavera. The question really is, with the Art Loss Register, we're now in a sort of position where we have a monopoly almost on this specific, very niche service because the market wants one source that they know they can check and they can cover themselves. And I'm really curious to see what it's going to be like. Is there going to be one dominant blockchain at one point, or is there going to be a few, but with more possibility to transfer the full set of data from one to the other?
Mm-hmm. All right, I wanted to address the question of copyright. When awareness of NFTs spread in 2021, a lot of people assumed that they were a form of digital rights management, a sort of more technologically advanced version of the Getty Images watermark, but that's not the case. Ownership of an NFT does not necessarily confer copyright any more that when you own a painting or a sculpture, you don't necessarily have the copyright for that either. Like just because the Louis Vuitton Foundation owns a Joan Mitchell painting doesn't mean they can make a Louis Vuitton ad with a Joan Mitchell painting in it. So I'm curious where you think this misconception about NFTs and copyright comes from. And also if you think that there are any possible useful applications for encoding copyright or other authors' rights in NFTs. And this is an open question for anyone who wants to answer.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit. Something that was coming to mind as you were talking about disputes. This is one of my favorite NFT myths to dispel, by the way, is NFTs are not DRM, NFTs are not copyright. And particularly because I actually think the ways in which they're not are one of their most interesting and useful affordances. But it does lead to these. I'm going to like an example that has to do with disputes. So I can own an NFT. NFTs decouple ownership from access to content. So you might own an NFT, but the file or artwork that that NFT points to is online actually all the time for anyone to view. There's this sort of separation. And that also leads to some very interesting and novel edge cases for an artist. Like, for example, if you're loaning work to an exhibition, do you, well, normally, you put it in a box and you sign a loan contract. But with the case of an NFT, do I have to transfer the NFT to the wallet of the gallery that is exhibiting it? Or do I just tell them, oh, the file is online at this URL? I've also had cases where I've had an NFT collected, and then somebody wants to exhibit it. Well, actually, the file for the video is online all the time. The exhibition space can put it in without even contacting the collector. At least, technically speaking, it is possible. So what are the norms that are required here? I've never had any of these situations result in a dispute, and I am lucky enough that I actually know most of my collectors so that I can email them and get permission when this comes up. But there are all these new funny edge cases in terms of permissioning, I think.
I have an example that kind of made me realize it. So my last business was a lot about exhibition loans, so I think that might have been where I started thinking about, wait, but how do people want to display this digital art? It's not mentioned in the NFT. The artwork doesn't include information about how it should be physically shown. But it became really apparent to me when I was doing a talk about the future of the metaverse and those types of things, and I decided to include a few artworks by generative artists. This was back in 2019. Include some images by generative artists, and I decided to put instead of using PowerPoint, I made it like a metaverse gallery. So all my slides were on the walls, and then like I could walk people around during the presentation and show them the artworks. And one of them was this generative artwork, but I spoke to the artist and said, hey, I'm gonna put your work here for this talk. And he, at first, got very upset. And he said, I would never show my artwork like that. Because it was a white cube, it was kind of like an image of the work on a white wall, kind of like that. And he was like, I don't like my artwork being seen even in the metaverse in that way. And that was the moment that I suddenly realized, like, wow, how would I have known that? And with the freedom that you get with NFTs, that you can actually use those images and like plug in your wallet and import it into a gallery and show them off in a certain way, how do we know from the artists how they want that to be shown? Eventually he understood it was just a PowerPoint and he was kind of cool. It wasn't a virtual exhibition and that type of stuff. But that was the moment that I realized, like, wow, there's some information missing here from artists that we need to have. Have you had that with your work, that anyone? Sorry, you're the one asking questions.
I mean, my understanding is that this can actually happen in the physical object art world as well, though. If you sell a work to someone, it might be put in an exhibition in the future by the collector that you might not actually know about. It's just so much easier. I mean, personally, I think it's quite beautiful that the work is so easy for a public all over the world to see. But there are many situations that can arise, and I have been lucky enough not to encounter them.
Yeah, if I can add on this, I think there is also this very challenging legal question, which is like, how do we, so by default, when you get an NFT, you just get a title of property of something that is somewhere else. How do you actually associate specific rights to the NFT? In the sense that today, if I buy a painting or if I buy a book, I just have the copy, but I don't really have any right over the content. When you move into the digital space, you kind of always need some rights, because otherwise you cannot display it anywhere. And I think there's this like a lot of the NFT platforms today, they actually, within the term of use, they provide some rights. It's usually like publishing on social media, putting it in like virtual galleries and so forth. and then you need to prove that you own the NFT in order to exercise this right. The problem with that is that you have the rights that are decoupled from the NFT, meaning that at any time, and it has happened already, the online platform can change the terms of use. And so I bought an NFT and I thought I had specific rights, but because now the platform is changing them, now I look at my NFT and it's like, oh, well, I cannot really prove that I had any rights because it's not encoded into the NFT. And so I think there is this new need, and I think it's starting slowly, but it's still very embryonic, which is the licensing term of the NFT needs to be embedded directly into the NFT so that it becomes immutable. And so you have a legal license, a copyright license, and then you hash it, you put the hash into the NFT so that you know that no one can then change those terms and conditions. And this is something we're working with a little team of lawyers, which is, we call it like the token-bound license, which is kind of like a legal innovation in the sense that it kind of rely on the same principle of open source and Creative Commons, but in order to make sure that the license follow the tokens. So instead of having a personal license, because I sold you the NFT, I'm giving you a personal license, but then when you transfer the NFT, the personal license is still between me and you. And so embedding a particular public but conditional license into the NFT so that the license actually is public to everyone upon the condition that you are the token holder. And therefore, when you transfer it, automatically the terms and conditions are transferred to the new token holder. And so this is really something that this space needs to work out because it's kind of unacceptable to provide centralized terms of use over something that should not be in the control of the platform anymore. And then the second one about the DRM, I think that there is actually, while NFTs are obviously not DRM, there is a possibility, and we're seeing it already with like token-gated communities, where you need to hold an NFT in order to access a space, an online space, and the space is just checking, do you have the NFT or not? So the same principle can easily be adopted for like token gate content access, which is I can only download something if I have the NFT, I can only stream something if I have the NFT. And so all of a sudden, the NFT, while it's not the DRM itself, can become quite a powerful component for DRM that rely upon that are capable of reading the blockchain to decide what to allow and not to allow to the user.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Sarah made a great point about NFTs sort of decoupling ownership and access. And yet at the same time, there are ways in which they can be used to enforce a kind of enclosure, like token gating, at the same time as like encouraging more openness. Like there's so many NFT projects that are experimenting with CCO where they give rights to the holders. I think we might want to open it up to questions at this point. If anyone in the audience has something they'd like to say. Yes, over there. Wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Carrie Gerbrecht. I'm interim director of Art Ledger, which is bringing Web3 standards to the art world. And I have a question, namely for Amelie, which is, we're talking about all these legal rights, but no legal domain is established. A lot of this activity is international, and especially when it's taking place in the metaverse. So how are disputes, and anyone can answer this, but you're the lawyer, so I'm sorry, but how are these disputes settled if oftentimes the contracts are useless or unapplicable in the actual place that that the conflict arises?
I mean, quite frankly, the answer is I don't know. The conflicts we have seen so far have been resolved in the way that we resolve them at the Atlas Register by talking, by bringing the people together and finding a solution. But for that, you need to have two parties who want to engage and who are willing to compromise. It's always going to be compromise. If you don't have that on either side, then I think, for me at the moment, I don't know the solution. I don't know if any of you have one. I'd be really interested to hear that as well.
I think there's the question of what is the actual jurisdiction that applies, and then there is the question of to which extent any jurisdiction has the power to enforce a decision. And I think there is few disputes because, in fact, people know that anyhow there is no enforceability except like finding external thing, like pay damages or something like this. The solution, I believe, is like blockchain-based dispute resolution systems, which is when I enter into a transaction, I want to make sure that if anything goes wrong, there is a possibility of resolving the dispute. And so this transaction will be a particular smart contract transaction that comes with an integrated dispute resolution system. And the resolution system can be connected to an existing court or can be to private arbitration and so forth. But because there is no enforceability, we need to create a system that enables enforcing a decision, and that system needs to be itself a blockchain-based system.
I think just to jump in is maybe, we have a long history of hacks and thefts not related to artwork in the blockchain world that are maybe interesting prototypes. And if to be frank, I think most of the perpetrators walk free. There have been, I think the 2016 DAO hack is like a really interesting example to talk about in this like legal context, because this is a smart contract bug that was exploited, resulting in a, I don't remember the number, very significant amount of money stolen. And then the hacker published a letter that said, I have discovered the feature in your smart contract that allowed me to claim this amount of money, and because this code pretends to be law, I have rightfully taken it, basically arguing. And this created such a dilemma in the community. At the time, it posed existential risk to the blockchain it was running on, because it was such a significant portion of the currency that was in circulation at all at that time. And there was a huge debate, ultimately resulting in like the creation of two networks going forward. One network on which the hacker kept all the money, and it still exists today. And then the network where the majority of people who wanted to reverse the hack had basically rewritten the supposedly immutable rules to allow a reality where the hack never happened. And both of those chains live today. And the one where the rules were reversed is the one we call Ethereum now. And there are many, many other like very interesting examples. And I don't believe that hacker has ever been caught. So.
Yes, we have a question over here. I also just wanted to say, I think if you look back to 2015, so many people who were theorizing uses of the blockchain were talking about things like real estate, and yet our digital art especially has become the main test case because the market is relatively unregulated and it's so international. So I think that's interesting that this is where a lot of these issues around blockchain and ownership are being tested. Yeah, but is the microphone?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think my question is mainly to Primavera, but basically to anybody else too. So I think in a recent past we saw a switch from the artwork being mainly kind of object of the power dynamics in the art industry, but now we kind of see some sort of empowerment happening, like the artwork doing things that the collector or the artist maybe haven't intended before. So my question to Primavera would be, how do you envision the future of this dynamic? So could the artwork probably become even more full of responsibility and agency? So how does the future look like? And how are we prepared for this? Because I guess especially collecting is also a lot about power. And so how will art collecting and exhibiting change if the artwork can do what it wants, basically, maybe in some time in the future?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you what I hope the future is. I'm not sure at all if that's where the future is going, but I'm going to try and push for that. I think for me it's really like changing the hierarchy. In the sense that today the artist is on the top of the hierarchy with respect to the artwork, and then the collector somewhere around, up, down, depends on the artist and the collectors. But you have the market that is dictating some preferences, and then the artist that might more or less be influenced by what the market wants, and then creates an art piece. And then if the art piece pleases the market, then the artist gets money and continue to create. What I'm trying to explore with Plantoid, and what I hope the blockchain art is actually enabling, is modifying this hierarchy in which the art piece should be at the top. Right? And so the art piece is at the top, the art piece is at the top, the art piece then funds the artist, which ideally is not always the same, because if you really want an artwork to be able to evolve freely, you want to explore multiple artists that will try to create some evolutionary directionality. So in the same way with open source and open content and Creative Commons, it's about let's actually free the artwork from the artist and let's see how it emerges. And then the collectors can be like, you need to embed them into the system. So in the case of Plantoid, the collectors, the people that eventually get the NFT, the one that collected at the end, are the ones that will vote on the propositions that have been submitted to the Plantoid that will then receive the funds. And so the collectors are still there. They just play a role that is secondary. Well, it's later on, it's subsequent. The collector will look at what are all the possibilities of evolution of a particular artwork, which the artists are submitting, and then will vote with their tokens. So they are not completely disappearing from the picture. They have been integrated, in this case, with the governance structure. And I think we can, because of blockchain, we can actually design new smart contract systems in which the artwork is attending both for the needs of the artist, for the needs of the collectors, but it is the art piece itself that collects the money, and therefore this is the one that gets a little bit higher at the hierarchy. I have no idea if this is ever going to happen, but I hope that there is at least more pieces that start exploring those new dynamics.
I think what you just described probably gives a lot of people a lot of angst about the future of technology ruling us and kind of that it's going to take over. And I think that is, going back to your point about digital art being the place where this kind of took hold, is because you can, so many digital artists are playing with AI and playing with these kind of training libraries. They're exploring kind of the boundaries of where copyright goes and all of these types of things that we're seeing in real time. A lot of the stuff that we have angst about in other parts of our lives, where AI is involved in social media, or where we are feeling that technology might be really influencing our lives. So I think that I believe probably, and I'm going to debate with you later, that the people will probably try to keep control of their systems to a certain extent, and that there will be a lot of desire to make sure that humans continue to have kind of the control of the network. But yeah, I guess that's kind of the side that I'm coming from.
Sarah, do you feel empowered, or do you feel like your artworks are in charge?
Yeah, both. I am definitely the servant of the life forms, sometimes keeping them running, updating the server, all of this. But also with some of my more recent work using AI, I'm actually very interested in setting some version of myself free to live outside of my body or outside of the identity that I might think of myself as controlling. I totally want other people to be able to take over the avatar of Sarah Friend, the artist, as well. So,
if I can add something to your response, but then we need a long conversation. I think maybe I formulated a little bit in a radical version, but what I'm saying is that I think in what I hope the future can be is really about co-authorship, but it's not co-authorship at the same time, it's co-authorship through time, in the sense that everyone that will remix the Plantoid, because the Plantoid has hired them, maybe they liked what they proposed better than what I proposed, in some way it is co-authoring with me, because it's still my work. No matter anyone that makes a plantoid, they will be the author of the particular piece, but it's still my work. And so, in fact, I'm the co-author of every descendant of the plantoid. I think it's the same with AI. It's like you're creating something, and then the AI is producing more of you, but it's kind of like a co-authorship, right? And to me, I'm very interested in seeing how by removing the one artist at the top that is kind of operating this exclusive control of how the artwork can evolve, and actually inviting more artists to engage and to take and to remix, and in some way they're actually working with or even for you to some extent. They're expanding your body of work, and they become the author or the co-author of that. And I think this is an interesting expansion, which I think is the next step after open source and Creative Commons, where you really like open up and actually enable the artwork to even find and fund additional artists to help you, in fact, in procreating your art pieces.
Can we do one last question, or do we have to stop? Yeah, over here.
My question is to Bernadine. We know that blockchain, NFTs, they consume a lot of energy, and they've been criticized for that. So when it comes to sustainability and environmental concerns, where do you think it's going? And is there going to be a parameter? Who's going to be setting that? Because I've been asking this question, and each region answers a different thing. And a lot of art fairs, the logo is like sustainability, but when you come have this discussion, no one knows. So I'm interested to know your opinion.
No, it's really interesting, and I think that blockchain is about redundancy, right? So blockchain is about storing something on multiple places so that you then don't have one entity controlling it. You have multiple entities having a copy. But I think that the place where and I'm not a huge technical person, but I'll say it in my way. The place where a lot of these emissions come from is actually from the consensus algorithms, where how do these machines agree that this is the right information? So they all have a copy, but then you also have to have mechanisms to verify that those copies are there. And those consensus algorithms are where the emissions are the strongest. And clearly, in public networks, where anyone can get involved and compute, it gets more, there is more redundancy. So it was part of the reason also why we decided to go for a bit of a smaller network for the art information. So that's kind of the discourse that's happening within Arcual. But I think that there are a lot of other ways in which people are thinking about sustainability and blockchain. I don't know if you want to say something about it, or
yeah, I think there is the proof of work, which is extremely energy consuming, and then there is proof of stake, which is marginally consuming, and it's just a matter of you have to pick your own consensus algorithm, and increasingly all the new blockchain are actually relying on proof of stake. So I think the energy consumption question becomes much less dramatic unless you're relying on Bitcoin-like type of blockchain. So I would say AI now is the real problem with energy consumption more so than blockchain.
Yeah, just to add to that, that discourse is about the energy use of NFTs is mostly from an era before September of last year. When the Ethereum network transitioned its mining algorithm to proof of stake, like Primavera just said. So to my knowledge, there are no major NFT chains that are still using proof of work, actually. Bitcoin does, and there's a Bitcoin-like NFT hype emerging, but it's many of the articles you will read online about this need to be updated.
And I think just going back to Bitcoin, I think we don't ship gold around the world to be able to have kind of the currency systems work. And I think what Bitcoin, I keep thinking about it very similar to gold, it's very heavy consuming, etc. But it has proven to be over time quite a reliable source of information. So it exists, and we just have to find ways to not be shipping gold all the time, I guess, is how I think about it.
All right, I think we have to end it there, unfortunately, because it looks like there are more questions. And of course, this panel has raised so many issues that are unresolved, which I think makes it an exciting conversation. So thanks to the panelists for their insights. And thanks to our Basel. This concludes the Conversations program.